Hello and welcome to CrossTalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. The inevitability of blowback and the perverse logic of terrorism. Ever since the U.S. embarked on its so-called war on terror, acts of terror and terrorist networks have proliferated. The recent deadly massacre in Kenya is a case in point. So is Washington's anti-terror strategy like a cure that is worse than the disease? To CrossTalk the War on Terror, I'm joined by Richard Barrett in New York. He is the Senior Vice President at the Soufan Group. In Washington, we have Kelley Vlahos. She is a journalist at antiwar.com. And in San Francisco, we cross to Stephen Zunes. He is the Chair of Middle Eastern Studies at the University of San Francisco. All right, folks, CrossTalk rules in effect. That means you can jump in anytime you want, and I very much encourage it. Kelley, if I go to you first, thinking about Kenya, when I think about Kenya, I think, well, everything that went wrong in Somalia. So Somalia is broken, and now we have these other groups, which many would say American policy and Western policy in Somalia generated these groups, and now it's just spreading further. As I said, is the cure worse than the disease here when we look at the war on terror?
Well, let's consider for a moment what's been going on for the last 12 years in Somalia. We've had CIA, covert operations. We've had Joint Special Operations Command forces doing covert operations. We've had private contractors, CENTCOM, military, all operating in Somalia since 9/11. They've been conducting targeted assassinations, airstrikes, drone strikes, all of effective civilians there. They've scattered Islamist groups, but also created new ones, including Al-Shabaab, which has taken responsibility for what happened in Kenya. The United States has worked with Ethiopia and Kenya to bring invading forces into Somalia, which have been responsible for brutal human rights violations. The United States has created an intelligence infrastructure in Somalia, the notorious jail or prison interrogation center at the airport there, as reported by Jeremy Scahill, in which they have assisted Somali government officials in interrogating people that they've dragged off the streets in these dank, dirty, drug-infested, insect-infested cells underground. The idea of blowback here isn't a surprise. We are seeing the remnants or the outgrowth of what our policy, the United States policy, has been in the last 12 years there. Okay, Stephen, in San Francisco, that's not a very optimistic report there. I mean, I just don't see the learning curve here. I mean, you go in to try to stabilize Somalia. Somalia becomes a broken state, a failed state, and then it exports what's wrong with that country. I mean, what's the security interest of the United States in trying to continue down this path of fighting terror?
Well, it even goes back further to the years the United States supported the Barrett regime and his the former Somali dictator's brutal repression and divide and rule policies, which upon his overthrow in a popular uprising in early 1991 created this power vacuum, of which initially was filled by various clan militia, and then with the U.S. intervention and other miscues created this power vacuum that hardline Islamists try to take advantage of. Instead of working with some of the more moderate elements, like in the Islamist courts, the United States came down hard with drone strikes and other forms of intervention, either directly or by proxy. And indeed, we've created this kind of monster now. I mean, the good news, I suppose, is that Al-Shabaab has been losing support in Somalia, not just from military intervention or losing battles with the Somali government, but because their style of leadership is very unpopular in Somalia. Their ultra hardline misinterpretation of Islam, their draconian practices, does not have that much popular support. And indeed, I think, and it's because of their losing ground, they're getting desperate. I think they went and did this desperate act in Kenya. So what I'm saying is I think the good news is they're on decline, but I think the intervention, from the West is making things worse, and that the decline would happen inevitably just because the Somalis don't like that kind of rule. They don't like that kind of violence, don't like that kind of extremism.
Yep. Richard, if I can go to you in New York, I mean, but then again, going after these groups, these fanatical groups here, it creates more blowback. What I'm getting at, from what we just heard from Kelley and from Stephen, it ends up being a very vicious cycle here. When we have extremists and terrorists, and then this response, drones, changing governments, manipulating governments. It's a vicious circle. It feeds off of itself.
Well, Al-Shabaab is a product of what's going on in Somalia, of course. And, as Stephen said, it's a very complicated situation there, with lots of clans involved, with a struggle for power in various different areas of the country, or the country as it was since 1991, when the government collapsed. And the forces in there are, of course, originally African Union forces, but now they're UN forces. The AMISOM is a UN force trying to allow the transitional federal government to establish some sort of stability. And Al-Shabaab is fighting the UN forces. And, of course, all members of the United Nations and Security Council in particular have mandated those forces to try and help the transitional federal government. And Al-Shabaab, yes, it's attacking outside, and it attacked, of course, in Kampala in 2010 during the World Cup final there, because Uganda is also a troop contributor, a major troop contributor to the AU forces as they then were. And, of course, Kenya. And Kenya is particularly active, of course, in the area of southern Somalia, where Al-Shabaab is trying to maintain its support, and indeed kicked Al-Shabaab out of Kismayo, the main port, and therefore the main source of their revenue. But I think we have to look at this in two ways. First of all, there's a Somali issue going on here, and then there's an international issue. If you look at the statement made by Al-Shabaab about the Westgate attack, one thing was, Kenyans, you better get out of Somalia, or else you'll face more than this. And the second thing was, international community, you better stop supporting the Kenyans and supporting the others in fighting in Somalia. So there's a sort of transition there from a local issue to an international issue. And Stephen made a very good point about the unpopularity of Al-Shabaab and the divisions in Al-Shabaab, which of course led to a great deal of bloodletting in recent weeks and months within Al-Shabaab.
Okay, Kelley, but in the last 12 years, again, we go back to 1991, when considering what Stephen had to say, is Africa a better off place or worse off place because of America's anti-terrorism strategy? I mean, worse off, better off?
Well, I don't want to say worse off, better off. I would take a look at what's going on in Somalia now. Are the people less or worse off? I would say they haven't been able to move forward since 1991, and I think that's an important point to make. We are meddling in Somalia, which dates back to, as Stephen said, before 1991, before September 11th, has created not only a power vacuum, but also a humanitarian crisis. Add in a famine there, add in a refugee crisis, and I cannot say that the people there are any better. The people are civilian casualties due to U.S. airstrikes, civilian casualties due to drone strikes, invading forces coming in, raping, pillaging, the fact that there is no stability in that country right now. I agree with Stephen that Al-Shabaab is on the decline there because of its unpopularity with the people, but that doesn't make the country any more stable. And we can look at other places, Nigeria, the Congo, Libya, as well as Mali, and we can see that the Islamist movements that have been born in part from U.S. intervention
the point I'm getting
have created
right, Stephen, if I go to you, but I mean, all of the countries that Kelley just mentioned there, a lot of them have to do with Western interventions. I mean, this is what I'm getting at. I mean, it makes things even worse, and these groups are replaced by other groups, okay? It's again, this cycle continues, and I don't see it being broken. It's just that the Americans will just expand their presence in Africa because, oh my goodness, look what happened in Kenya. Something must be done. We keep hearing that. Something must be done. Go ahead.
It does become kind of a game of whack-a-mole, smashing down one terrorist cell here, another one pops up immediately, and there's a reason for that. That, just as during the Cold War, the United States, would intervene in the name of anti-communism, not recognizing that a movement's power came not from their study of Marx and Lenin, but from nationalism, and that it was many of these communist movements were a reaction, or communist-led movements were a reaction to Western imperialism, to Western involvement by propping up right-wing dictatorships and bombing and intervening. We are creating more communists than we were suppressing. Same thing has been happening in the so-called war on terror. That the U.S. intervention is creating this backlash effect. It's creating the very enemy that we're trying to suppress. That you have these extremist Islamist groups that are taking advantage of this nationalist reaction that people have to a foreign intervention, and those wishing, and outsiders coming in and trying to run things. And so, the fact is, I've been traveling to the Middle East for more than 30 years, and it's clear that the more the United States militarizes the region, the less and less secure we're becoming.
Okay, Richard, do you want to react to that? Interventions is probably one of the clearest indicator. It's the biggest advertising, recruiting for these kind of extremists.
Well, yeah, but whose intervention are we talking about here? I mean, if you're looking at West Africa, for example, as I think Stephen was mentioning, or Kelley was mentioning, I mean, in Nigeria, the opposition to Boko Haram is entirely local. The opposition to Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, well, of course, the French moved in to try and push them out of Mali, but generally speaking, the work against Al-Qaeda in Islamic Maghreb has been essentially regional. And
all right, folks, I have to jump in here. I'm sorry, Richard. We have to jump in here. I'm going to go to a short break, and after that short break, we'll continue our discussion on the war on terrorism. Stay with RT. Welcome back to CrossTalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. To remind you, we're discussing America's war on terror. Okay, Kelley, I'd like to go back to you in Washington. I think as most people watch this program on a regular basis, I'm a cynic at heart, okay? So I'm going to say my cynical thoughts here. When I look at these interventions and the meddling in these countries in Africa, it seems to me that the West, particularly the United States, thinks they can control the things on the ground once they get things started. But it never seems to work out that way. There's always a ripple effect. It spreads someplace else. Maybe you can control a place for a short while, and then you get these unintended consequences. And it seems to happen over and over again. And I can go back all the way to the Soviet experience in Afghanistan, all the way to Kenya last weekend.
Yeah, and just talking a little bit about Mali, for an example, I mean, what our airstrikes, the U.S.-led airstrikes in Libya, had a ripple effect in which a lot of the weapons that were poured into that cause, the rebel cause there, had found their way to Islamist fighters who were fighting in the coup and subsequent insurgency in Mali. So that's a perfect example. Going back to a little bit about whether or not Africa is worse off, one of the things that I failed to mention is that the humanitarian aid from the United States has not kept up with the military aid that we have poured into Africa. President Obama has not followed through on many of his promises to help with the famine and the humanitarian crisis there, but he has helped in spreading the footprint of U.S. military throughout Africa. There's over 5,000 troops there, and in I think at least 12 different countries. And I just read today that they're expanding the base in Djibouti. So we're looking at a situation where military intervention has come first before humanitarian assistance. And I think a lot of the blowback, much of the blowback is from people like you had pointed out, that are reacting to our meddling and not any assistance that we've been given to Africa.
Stephen, Kelley said the right word, footprint. And again, being a cynic, this is a great way. You have to fight terrorism. These terrible people, that what they did in Kenya, we have to send in the troops. We have to arm these people. We have to find allies. And this is the same thing over and over again. And again, being very cynical, and I don't want to be misunderstood here, is that this is a wonderful enemy to have, because it's a very clear reason we have to do something, and we must beef up these people. I mean, I was listening to Lyndon Johnson, the tape recordings about how he didn't want to get into Vietnam, and all these people that were saying, but if you don't, this is going to happen. You're going to look weak, and these people are going to take over. It's just amazing, the duplication that's going on right now. It's all about the footprint. It's the footprint.
Yeah. Well, it's very much about this idea of imposing military solutions to complex political, social, and economic problems. And it's not that some form of force isn't sometimes necessary.
Sure.
We're dealing with dangerous terrorist cells. I'm not saying that that U.S. or other countries shouldn't send in advisors and counterterrorism support in certain, again, very narrow cases where you have actual intelligence about specific cells. But when you go in and you start bombing a country, when you bring in troops, when you give lots of military aid to regimes that in the name of counter-terrorism use it to suppress legitimate political dissent, I mean, I think that's where it becomes a problem. I remember seeing some statistics. I'm glad Kelley mentioned the foreign aid question, because I remember seeing something 8 or 10 years ago that the only place in the Islamic world that public opinion of the United States had gone up since 9/11 was in Aceh after the tsunami, and a part of northern Pakistan after a major earthquake, where the U.S. sent in large amounts of humanitarian aid. This is the way to win hearts and minds, not by militarizing situations, not by supporting repressive regimes, because in an ironic way, President Bush was right when he said that repressive governments end up breeding terrorists. Of course, Bush was talking about spreading democracy from Damascus to Tehran, and while I agree that Syria and Iran could use more democracy, he wasn't talking about spreading democracy from Riyadh to Cairo or any number of the capitals of the dictatorships that the U.S. supports, where most of these terrorists actually come from. But the underlying point is that, as John F. Kennedy said, those who make peaceful evolution impossible make violent revolution inevitable. And if we're really interested in stopping terrorism, we should stop supporting dictatorial regimes and occupying armies, and stop militarizing these complex situations.
Richard, we've already hit on this point in the program, but giving aid and technology and investment, that's a lot less sexy than sending in the Marines, okay? And when you send in the Marines, you can affect something at least very quickly. It may not be the outcome that you want ultimately, but it's you get friends and allies and surrogates on the ground. But aid and development takes a lot more time, and it's not as popular during times of austerity in the West.
Well, indeed, but there's a massive amount of humanitarian aid going into Africa, and particularly from Western countries. And indeed, even President Bush, who was a bit of an interventionist, as we well know, is very well known in Africa for his AIDS campaign, support for the anti-AIDS campaign there, and he did a great deal of good in that. And since the first term of President Obama, since his election in 2008, there's been a huge withdrawal of America from this sort of interventionist policy. And I think that's matched by other countries as well. I mean, there's a withdrawal from Iraq and now a withdrawal from Afghanistan. And the thing about terrorism is obviously it's a scary thing, and the international community, particularly the major powers, have to consider their own domestic security as well as some sort of international responsibility. But just by giving aid, you don't solve the problem. If you look at the United Nations, for example, we've been attacked in Mogadishu, the UNDP offices there, the World Food Programme attacked in Pakistan, the UNAMA offices attacked in Afghanistan, the UN building in Abuja attacked in Nigeria. So the UN, which does is essentially a humanitarian organization, isn't immune from these attacks. So I think the real answer when you're countering terrorism is not to just flip from military support to humanitarian support or try and get those in better balance. It's more to understand why people are becoming terrorists in the first place. Why do they think they can only achieve their aims or feel this sense of empowerment and identity and so on by being violent? Why is it that they don't have better outlets to express their concerns and frustrations?
I think a lot of people would say because they're victims of violence itself from Western countries. Kelley, there's one issue I want to address.
Well, not from Western.
Okay, go ahead, Richard. Go ahead.
Not from Western countries, I don't think. I don't think they feel they're victims from Western countries. I think they may feel that they're victims from their local governments, which are supported by Western policies.
Fair enough.
But then again, they're terrorists because they're a group which find no way of exerting their voice, without maximizing their impact through terror, because there's not enough of them, of course. Like in the Arab Awakening, for example, you didn't see Al-Qaeda flags in Tahrir Square or in Tunisia or even earlier on in Syria and so on. In those revolutions, even in Libya too, you saw a popular movement. And where the popular opinion can have an impact, can have an effect, then you get change without violence.
Okay, Kelley, that we know, at least it's been alleged, that a number of Americans were involved in this attack in Kenya. This is very interesting, and looking at the recruiting of these organizations, I don't know all of them and I don't know all the details, but more and more Western nationals are involved here. Syria is a good case in point here. This is very interesting as well, is because this is not only something happening far, far away, but it's something getting closer and closer to home. I think at the last count there was over 1,000 EU nationals in Syria fighting with the rebels. I mean, this is another one of the blowbacks, the cancer that this war on terror creates.
Well, yeah, and I think Stephen alluded to this, that the attack that we saw in Kenya the other day was the result of a splinter within Al-Shabaab. You have these competing forces. On one side, you have the Al-Shabaab, who is fighting to get the Kenyans and the Ethiopians out of Somalia. It's a more localized effort. And then you have a more transnational Al-Shabaab that's affiliated with Al-Qaeda and has broader transnational aims. We see in recent reporting that the latter had won out, and we saw that in the massive attack on the mall the other day. That transnational effort includes, like you said, many fighters from across the globe, including fighters that have come from as close to the United States as Minnesota. There's a huge Somali population there. The FBI has been watching them for years. Turns out that they've been doing, Al-Qaeda and Al-Shabaab has been doing some very effective recruiting from that population.
Well, it's really incredible.
What we're seeing
it's
here
amazing.
is
Why didn't the NSA find this? What is the NSA doing, okay, if they're not finding people like this? It's extraordinary. Go ahead.
Yeah.
Jump in.
Yeah, actually, there was some news that came out just a year and a half, 2 years ago, that there had been a number of Somalis, Americans living in the Twin Cities that had been recruited by Al-Shabaab. They were following up on that. So this isn't new information, but it does raise kind of a bigger question that U.S. policy is alienating not just Muslims abroad, but even Muslims at home. And that, again, it raises serious questions about, whether this kind of counterterrorism strategy, which, puts so much emphasis on the military side, is doing more harm than good. I think the one hopeful sign we had initially, I think, was the Arab Spring, in the way that it showed that massive nonviolent action was far more effective at bringing down Western-backed dictators like those in Egypt and Tunisia and Yemen than was Al-Qaeda and their kind kind of apocalyptic ideology and genocidal tactics. But unfortunately, the way things have gone in Syria and Libya, and the struggles of consolidating democracy in Egypt and Yemen, I think has maybe given new life.
All right.
To those
Fascinating
who
discussion
are,
here. It seems to me that the war on terror has nothing to do with democracy in the world. Many thanks today to my guests in Washington, New York, and in San Francisco. And thanks to our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time. And remember, CrossTalk rules.
I love you.